Most serious competitor, China, but we are ready to work with Beijing.
On today's World Insight, cooperation amid competition or cutthroat rivalry, the direction of China-U.S. relations under a new U.S. administration, and hurdles to mass COVID vaccinations. How worried should we be? Insights from the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute.
We don't really know. The studies that we have done to date, they're not designed to look at protection of communities.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. After a heavy string of relations in the Trump years, where do the world's two largest economies, China and U.S., go from here? The new U.S. administration is finding its footing in approaching China while dealing with surging COVID infections and deaths at home. Gestures of goodwill have been extended to a certain extent to set a positive tone on relations, though many hope there could be more. What are the chances of getting relations back on a positive track? Is this what both sides want? Let's loop in our panelists. We are joined by a strong panel in Wyoming, U.S. We have Robert Ross, an associate from the John King Fairbanks Center of the Chinese Studies with Harvard University. Good to see you, sir. In Shanghai, Shending Li, professor from the Institute of International Studies, Fudan University. Good to see you. Last but not least, in Beijing, Professor Teng Jimeng from the Center of American Studies at Beijing Foreign Studies University. Good to see you, sir. Let me start by asking your quick response about the latest development. Both the presidential speech on the foreign policy and later phone conversation with director from China. And then we also see different talks coming from members of the administration. Now, what do you make the current status? Mr. Ross, can you help us?
Well, the optimistic, positive view is that we have a new administration concerned that they might be tested by the Chinese. But the Chinese may think don't have the resolve to contend with China. So they're beginning by laying down markers that we will be tough and we will bargain hard. That's the optimistic view because it suggests that as time develops, we'll be more comfortable with the conciliatory phase of the relationship. However, the negative one is that they're prepared to continue Trump administration policies. And that would not be good for the United States or for U.S.-China relations.
Yeah.
So we'll have to wait and see what lasts, and we hope that the relationship can sustain itself and can withstand this early difficulties we're having.
I see. Professor Teng from Beijing, what's your reading?
I agree with Bob. I think, once again, I also hold this very optimistic viewpoint. I think the China-U.S. relations will be actually returned back on track, the right track, the stable, the constructed track, and especially with several of these founding professors, these great professors who have been laid the foundation for this very important relationship. Professor Ezra Vogel, a mutual friend of both, both me
but
and
what about the
also
relationship? Now I'm asking more about the political relationship.
Well, once again, I think each of our leadership are also working very hard. I mean, think about Blinken's call to China's leadership, to Mr. Yang Jiechi, and also our ambassador speaking on various occasions about the importance of returning the relationship back on this very right track. And so I'm optimistic.
Okay. Well, we have the optimistic person in the room, Professor Shen. Realistically speaking, where are we?
I think it's way too far to say the relationship will be back. At this time, U.S. need to have some time to review the relationship. It indicates in a nuanced way that it is likely to take a combination of cooperation and competition to handle China, instead of antagonize China through confrontation. But where to cooperate and where to compete, it's uncertain. And it takes time for the two countries to develop their future relations.
I really wondered, the three gentlemen, whether you heard the latest quote coming from a CBS interview with President Biden about China, and he said there's no reason that I don't make a call to my Chinese counterpart, President Xi Jinping. What do you make of that, Professor Tang, very briefly?
Well, once again, like he said, we don't need conflict. There's always room for cooperation. And so that brings me back to also to a very interesting book. Actually, I helped to translate by Professor Robert Ross, which is called Negotiating Cooperation. And so I think it's time for cooperation. It's time for negotiating rationally and forgetting about the insanity of the previous administration.
Since the other person's name is being mentioned, Mr. Ross, I come back to you. Well, maybe the three of you would agree with one another. That may not be that difficult, but to deal with Washington today, it's a different story. So, Mr. Ross, what do you think exactly President Biden is trying to convey in that message? There's no reason why I don't make a call.
I think the administration is still going through its China policy, trying to decide where to position itself, and having laid down some fairly tough markers, including most recently 2 carriers going into the South China Strait. The president, we hope, may feel more comfortable once these markers are laid down to try and open up a dialogue with President Xi. But I think we're still in a transition. They don't have their feet on the ground yet, and we'll have to wait and see.
Professor Shen, you've been through many U.S. administrations and having been doing analysis about them, a lot of times actually you're right. But let me ask you about this complicated situation. We see mixed messages coming from some of the key members of the current administration. The Secretary of State is saying one thing, well, to a certain degree, and then the President is saying something like a little bit different. And then we also have different people when testify at the Capitol Hill trying to get their position, saying different things about China. So Professor Shen, should we take these words seriously, or actually we should be more certain in a way, because that's how an administration began?
Well, actually, these different new officials are saying the same thing. They would continue the former President Trump's China policy. But they think Trump's approach has not been effective. So they are going to search for a more effective way to achieve the same objective of Trump, making America great again, not China great again. So with China as number 2 in terms of the economic output and the general global international competitiveness, U.S. has a great consensus forged by the former President Biden, that China is catching up and China is going to on a par with the U.S. probably in the next 1 or 2 decades. So U.S. people have been mobilized. No matter Biden or Trump, they are unwilling to see America would be on a par with China. They are going to make China continue to be behind of the U.S.
Right.
I think this is the messages they sent.
No matter what the message is, let's take a look at what has happened. Some say history could be of some reference. Well, to what degree, I don't know, especially for now, but certainly they are the only tools that we have on hand to help us right now. So let's take a look at some of the recent stories that all of you gentlemen mentioned directly or indirectly. The passed away of several gigantic figures who have been contributing to China-U.S. relations over the decades. One of them is former Secretary of State George Shultz. He passed away on Sunday. During his tenure, he and his counterparts helped bring an end to the Cold War. Of course, that's about U.S. and the former Soviet Union. He also made positive efforts in laying the bedrock of China-U.S. relations. In a recent Washington Post essay he wrote, quote, "Trust is the coin of the realm. It's an age-old lesson that this respected diplomat leaves U.S." Let's take a look at my brief interview with Robert Format, who is the vice chairman of the Kissinger Associates and a longtime friend of Mr. George Shultz. Let's take a look. Mr. Format, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're one of your best friends and respected diplomat, Secretary Shultz, passed away. Your personal thought?
Well, I'm very sad. He was a great man. He did great things for our country, the U.S., and for the world. And he had integrity. He had good judgment. He listened to people. He didn't jump to conclusions. He had a view of the world that was constructive, that was not a negative-sum game, but he believed that U.S. and China and other countries could work together to work out problems if they did it in a rational way. And he had a great sense of vision about a better world, and he worked very hard to make this a better world.
I know he recently, in fact, not long before he passed away, wrote an article for Washington Post about building trust in a very uncertain world. How important is trust? How do you see his generation even manage to build trust out of also extremely difficult situation of the Cold War?
That was a remarkable article for anyone, but George Shultz really, in a very few words, underscored the importance of trust. If you don't have trust, it is very hard to reach agreements. You're always fighting with one another. If you have trust, you may disagree, but you also know that you're working toward a common and constructive set of objectives. And I think that's what's important about trust, that you don't necessarily agree, but you trust that the other person has good intentions and the other person trusts that you have good intentions. The level of trust between the United States and many countries has deteriorated, particularly over the last several years. Now we have to figure out a way of regaining that trust, so that I think that every Foreign Service officer in our country, the U.S., in China, in other countries as well, should read that, because if they understand that, it won't solve all of our problems, but it will make the effort to solve them easier.
Mr. Hormats, Dr. Kissinger and Secretary Shultz are great friends. You've been working for decades with Dr. Kissinger together, and they both shared in some recent speeches the common vision about building trust.
Well, I worked for Dr. Kissinger in the early 70s when he was having negotiations with Chairman Mao Zedong and with Premier Zhou Enlai, and then I've been going to China ever since. It's important that the two countries have a sense of vision about where their relationship is going, not just talk about transactional issues from a script, but having some broad objective and some confidence and some sense of trust in each other and what the other side's doing, and that we're trying to find common answers.
That was earlier Robert Hormats, the then Undersecretary of State, talking about the legend of Secretary George Shultz. It is not only one figure that we're talking about today, but several gigantic figures trying to create sound China-U.S. relations that passed away. One of them is Professor Ezra Vogel. Let's invite Mr. Ross to be with us to share more information about that, because we know you have been, Mr. Ross, working with Professor Ezra Vogel, a towering figure in East Asian studies who passed away at the age of 90 in December last year. Among his latest effort to improve U.S.-China relations was a draft statement that was still unfinished, and you edited the documents together with your colleague in his honor. Tell us more about that specific document.
Well, Ezra was convinced that mutual understanding was the key to better relations, and he was very concerned that the trend in relations under the Trump administration had created an atmosphere in which conflict was simply growing and more unmanageable. So he wanted to take the initiative with the new president to send out a message that there was hope and prospects and possibilities to improve relations if we simply step back and look what's simply in the interest of both countries, and that we didn't have irresolvable conflict. And if we understood each other, we could begin to cooperate. Now, of course, for Ezra, the easy, low-hanging fruit was academic cooperation, but it was also climate change, it was also world health. But there was a range of issues. It could be North Korea, it could be Iran. The United States and China need to cooperate rather than just see competition. But even for the competition, Ezra understood that it need not be escalatory and get out of hand, but that understanding each other, working together, we can manage this cooperation so that we can cooperate at the same time. And that's what he was trying to convey with that statement.
You know, Professor, Mr. Ross, I know that Professor Vogel has been focusing on the academic in-depth understanding of a culture when doing political analysis about that specific country. And he's been advocating that to particularly the younger generation of diplomats and also China watchers. But it seems that some in the latest generation have a very different view. They thought it's too old-fashioned, or they thought it is too far away from the reality of politics and geopolitics. Your take?
A number of things there. One, Ezra, yes, was committed to academics using their knowledge to help in U.S.-China relations rather than simply write articles and books for a narrow group of academics with dense footnotes and dense writing. So he wore two hats. He was foremost a scholar, but he was also a public person who believed in service, who believed in contributing to better relations to the United States and China, whether it was in the government, whether it was through his writings, but he believed that academics could play a role. And that was just critical, and in this time, we need that more than ever. Because we can't simply allow the Beltway, the think tanks, the policy analysis to drive the relationship.
Right.
Because their view of the relationship is deeply colored by the Washington community looking at China as a competitor rather than trying to understand the relationship.
Thank you very much, Professor Ross. I think I learned a lot. We hope many could also learn from the inspirations of the two persons that we mentioned. Let me invite back our panel again, because the other two gentlemen have also been interacting in various occasions with the two figures, Secretary Shultz and Professor Vogel, over the decades. But my question more, for example, Mr. Shen, Professor Shen, is more about what's next. It seems that we're still testing the temperature. It seems that it's not on the priority of the U.S. to think about an overall strategy toward China and approach toward China. But from the Chinese side, it is very important to see a sound relationship with the United States. One could argue the other way around too, but Professor Shen, so what's next?
So next for America is take time to breathe, to reflect, to review for whatever the policy that Trump has been right. For instance, in American view, to decouple between China and the U.S. in technology, most likely Biden will continue. And the Congress would not allow its government not to continue. But for global governance, like climate change and regional stability concerning Iranian nuclear issue, and U.S. would return to various regional and global regime and partner with other stakeholders to work together. So Biden needs to reflect. Also, he does not want to repeat what Trump has done, isolate American ally, beating each of them, and beating friends, beating competitors. Yeah. He wants to unite with a friend and to discuss, at least politically, how to work together to treat their relationship with China. So it's not Americans' policy, it is America plus. It's a friend's joint policy. He wants to be politically right. Therefore, he sent a message, I will call, but please wait a moment.
Right. Mr. Ross, of course, the allies of the U.S. might have now a somewhat different agenda when it comes to how to deal with China, because their economic, political, and social relations with China might be very different. So what do you think that it is possible to have a so-called unified approach, U.S. and allies, and also what do you think will be next? Mr. Ross.
We need to be careful before we assume that the Washington community is bent on regaining American superiority. It's in thoughts. There are debates. And recently we're hearing voices who are talking about, if you will, denial of China. And what do they mean by that? Denying Chinese superiority. Very different than recouping American superiority. A recognition that China is a peer. We need to accept that. So that is taking place in the United States, and we need to watch this debate. Second, the world is watching the rise of China. And the world understands that America is no longer going to be the dominant power in East Asia. And to the extent the United States tries to create a coalition to make the United States number one again, that will fail. But countries in the region want American presence, whether it's Singapore, the Philippines, Korea, Japan, and so they want to cooperate with us, but not in an environment which says, America says to them, you're on our side against China, but rather in a two great powers who are mutually cooperating and competing, and they can cooperate with both. Now, Europe is the problem. The United States wants to use Europe to signal this global coalition. Europe doesn't have a stake in East Asia. Europe's far away. They didn't have a stake in the Vietnam War. They didn't have a stake in the Korean War. They have their own issues in Europe. Now, America may be successful in a few symbolic moves, but no one in Europe wants to get involved and risk relations with China over the U.S.-China competition in Asia.
Well, I apologize. The sound quality might be a little bit difficult. However, I think we mainly pick up the main points. Professor Teng Jimeng, what do you think will be next? It seems that things are not as simple as you read in the newspaper.
Well, no, absolutely
or on the
not.
website.
No, absolutely not that very simple. And so that's why I kind of express a cautious optimism in the sense that I think that the Chinese market will continue to be attractive to investors from all over the world, and especially the United States. I think so. The next step, first thing first, I think that the Biden administration should come to realize that the market is huge. The market is also favorable to a kind of a further investment or American export to China. As Director Yang Jiechi actually told the interviewers during that very important interview, that there will be 20 trillion worth of goods, US dollar worth of goods coming to China, that can be exported to China. And to take for example, take cultural products, for example. China is now the largest film market. Last year, the film the film revenue actually reached 200 billion RMB yuan, and so making China the largest film market in the world. And so this proves to be a kind of a very, very attractive kind of a mecca for U.S. business people.
So you say business to begin with. Will that work, Professor Shen?
I'm afraid not. We should not merely focus on economics. We should work on political economy. U.S. is strategic. When China was weak, they think kind of a win-win. U.S. investing in China, U.S. losing some job, but U.S. gains a low price stuff is acceptable. But over time, with this addition of globalization, America lose. The more rich people invest in China, the more America will lose. This is a consensus. It's not the view of just Trump. It's a joint view of Trump plus Biden. They made it very clear in the Senate hearing. They support the principle and objective of Trump, but they differ with the approach. So this makes Biden very cautious. He should not repeat the mistake of previous government. in terms of approach, but he conquers with the principle that U.S. should win, not China should win.
Interesting. Mr. Ross.
Yes.
Will the economic
Can you hear
card
me?
work? Or
Yes.
actually, it is about the area that you've been talking about, the public health, the climate change, and also economic recovery. And yet, where to begin? Once again, that's the question.
Well, first, I think the economic card is the most powerful card China has for Europe. And that's the primary reason that Europe does not want to get involved in a U.S.-China Cold War. The United States, again, President Biden has made clear that the trade war was a disaster for the United States. So the issue, yes, the United States will compete. It doesn't want to simply allow China to gracefully become number one in the world, but that doesn't mean there's competition across the entire agenda. So for trade, there's some areas where we're not going to end trade. Trade, we're going to export to China, we're going to invest in China, but there may be areas in which we see strategic interests that we may try and curtail. That's very different in the Trump administration. Despite domestic politics, we should understand the president has great ability to lead in foreign policy. Most Americans don't care about foreign policy. They care about the economy, they care about immigration, they care about healthcare, and they don't vote on foreign policy, which gives the president a lot of leeway, which is where optimism comes from. We have heard him say again and again that the Trump policies have failed. So we hope that over time he develops his confidence, lays down to the markers, begins to negotiate. Literally, he wants to negotiate with China over trade.
Right. One final question, very quick round for everyone. Back in the 1970s and 80s, for example, during the Secretary Schultz era, we see leaders have to have new visions in order to face unprecedented situation. Now, can we still cultivate that ambience for new vision right now? Are you seeing hope in that regard, or we are just going to have one transactional relationship, somewhat of it, in the near future? Mr. Ross, briefly.
This will take two sides to cooperate. The Chinese are feeling very confident these days. They've done well over the last 4 years. They survived the COVID better than most countries. And so the Chinese side needs to be willing to cooperate and make concessions. And the American side has to be willing to negotiate. Negotiation is a word that we don't hear very frequently in Washington. Reducing tension is the word we hear. So going forward, there can be hope if we focus on interests instead of simply hurling accusations across the Pacific Ocean.
All right. Professor Teng.
Well,
Quick
my
round,
words,
this is.
yeah, I think that we should let the process of convergence continue and we be respectful of our valid differences and then work together to overcome those differences.
Okay.
At the same time, leaders should also learn and understand and practice what we call the virtue, and so that we can serve the people on both sides of the Pacific Ocean.
I see. Professor Shen Ding Li, last but not least.
I do think there are more opportunity for the Biden administration to work with China. But I'm afraid that the time has changed. China-U.S. will be very difficult to return to the short era when China was integrated to the world.
Yeah.
Today, China wants the world to work with China, not we are integrated. But the two sides need to be unequal. And America cannot accept equality. That made me to be pessimistic.
Maybe the conclusion is too early. Mr. Ross just reminded us there are different thoughts going on inside the United States. We'll see how things will play out. Thank you so much. As always, Robert Ross, Shen Ding Li, Teng Jimeng. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you. And you're watching World Insights. Coming up in the program, hurdles to mass COVID vaccinations, from production and delivery bottlenecks to skepticism and concerns over new virus variants. How worried should we be? Insights from the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. Right up. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The world has now topped 106 million confirmed COVID-19 cases, with worries over new coronavirus variants. Also, a slower than expected vaccine rollout in the U.S., coupled with the UK's decision to delay second doses, weighed on concerns. With vaccines on hand and more on the way, how far are we from a COVID-free world? How much challenge do the new variants pose to the vaccines we have? On that, earlier during this year's Davos Forum, I spoke to Jerome Kim, who is the director of the International Vaccine Institute. Let's listen in. In Seoul, we are joined by Jerome Kim, Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. Dr. Kim, what a pleasure.
Great to see you again.
Good to see you, sir. There have been enormous amount of info coming out regarding the efficacies of vaccines. What do you make of their efficacy these days, especially when there are enormous amount of uncertainties involving the variants and mutations?
I think it's really important to remember that, with many of these vaccines, we have at the most 2 to 3 months worth of reported data on efficacy, that is the prevention of COVID-19 disease, and safety. And for us to really begin to address this problem, we will hope, and there's every reason to expect, that these vaccines will be safe and efficacious for a longer period of time. We just, unfortunately, at this point, don't know how long.
The booster shots, Dr. Kim, which the pharmaceutical companies have promised to deal with the new variants, when they give us the number, or when they are saying this is effective, how should we know? Because it takes quite a while to do tests and trials for any of the vaccines that we're talking about that are efficient today. So how long will it take for trials and lab tests before they can tell us the booster shot will be efficacious for the latest variant?
So the issue here is actually something, what you're talking about is something we call a correlative protection. And what is a correlative protection? When you give the shots to people, you measure their blood to find out whether the shots are generating what we call antibody or immune responses, protective responses against the virus. What we'll do then, after we have evidence that a vaccine is protecting against infection, we can then go back and look at the blood of the people who were protected after vaccination and the blood of people who were vaccinated and became infected. And what we may then come up with, and it depends on how well we can look and what kinds of questions we can ask with the blood samples that we collect from patients after vaccination, we may be able to come up with 1 or 2 laboratory tests that will tell us, if you have this level of protective antibody, you should be protected. Once you have that, it's possible then to use that, what we call correlative protection, to speed up the development of new vaccines, to make the trials much smaller, to optimize the dose and the schedule, and to determine when we should boost people. So say we decide that neutralizing antibody, I'm using this as an example, neutralizing antibody is the correlative protection. And once we know the level of neutralizing antibody that's necessary to protect people, then we can plan when to boost someone based on how quickly the level of the neutralizing antibody goes down.
I see.
We can also then tell, the same way we do for influenza vaccine, when we need to develop new strains. And we can tell, based on just the laboratory testing, whether that vaccine should protect. So again, a lot will depend on the development of these correlates of protection. And all the companies that have announced results are actually looking right now to see if they can identify this correlate. And we're expecting that in February, probably by March, we may start to see early data, early scientific information about a correlative protection. But that's going to be really important because, there's a long line of vaccines that are still in development. Right. Some of them may actually be better than the vaccines we have now. The best way to be able to test them and to test them quickly will be if we have this correlative protection.
Yeah. What is the quickly that you are talking about? Is there a time frame?
Yeah, so it does take a while. And the reason is that you have to isolate the virus, you have to sequence it, you have to move that sequence into additional kinds of tests. And then you have to actually get the blood from people who have received the vaccine and test it to see if it inactivates the new mutant strain.
Right.
But we have a real world example. So you know that every year the companies come out with a new influenza vaccine. Well, that vaccine is developed over the course of 6 to 9 months. So again, it's once you understand what the level of protective antibodies should be, you can use the correlative protection theoretically to accelerate the development of new vaccines. So hopefully, again, the widespread vaccination of individuals and more rigorous following of the requirements for social distancing and masks and avoiding crowds will help us to control the virus itself, will reduce the number of mutations. That's one aspect. And then as the new mutations come out, we really need a worldwide system that is open, transparent, and shares information about the new mutants very quickly so that the companies can rapidly test their vaccines against these new mutants in a test tube. Actually showing protection, I mean, to actually go out and do another trial, a very large trial, involving 40,000 people will be very difficult right now, especially with safe and effective vaccines already being approved by a number of major organizations, the NMPA in China, the FDA in the United States, the European Union, EMA.
300 million, that's the US target for summer, something like this summer, according to the new administration. What does that say to the proactive herd immunity? Would those numbers be enough for proactive herd immunity?
So, unfortunately right now we have an estimate, a scientific best guess about the number of people, the percentage of people who need to be vaccinated in order to develop this herd protection. Initially, we thought it might be 60%, but you've noticed maybe recently people have been talking about 70% or 80%. Well, one of the key things here is that we don't really know. The studies that we have done to date really, again, are designed to look at protection of an individual. They're not designed to look at protection of communities. We need to do those studies to understand how effective these vaccines are in populations.
Right.
If we vaccinate 50% of a Chinese city or 50% of a city in the United States, will we see significant decreases in transmission to people who are not vaccinated? And that would be the true demonstration of herd protection. Those studies need to be done. And I think one of the things that the Chinese government and Chinese vaccine companies could do to help is to start the process of doing what we call effectiveness trials, helping us to understand the impact of vaccines on transmission, helping us to understand the impact of vaccines on transmission of mutant viruses. Because again, decreasing the number of infections may actually decrease the number of mutants. But do the Chinese, Sinopharm or Sinovac vaccines develop neutralizing antibody that protects against mutant strains? And again, I think people are waiting to hear from the companies to find out if this is the case.
So, Dr. Kim, there are only a few options when it comes to vaccines. How should the public approach the topic of vaccine and choose the right timing to have the vaccine, particularly given the fact that there are mutations and variants that could be still appearing in the near future, particularly at the winter time when we see the world is very much bogged down by COVID-19 already?
I think the best way to look at it is to look to the regulators. And we don't like to necessarily do that, but these are the agencies around the world which are entrusted by their governments to make sure that vaccines that are used in the public are safe and efficacious. So in the US, it's the Food and Drug Administration. In China, it's the NMPA. For the European Union, it's the EMA. When they look at the data, they say, okay, the clinical trial was well done. The data show safety and show protection against COVID-19 disease at the following level, 95%. And when they give their approval, they're saying that we have reviewed the information. Sometimes they've repeated the analysis to confirm that the analysis is correct. they also stand by the quality of the vaccine. So, for instance, the US FDA or the EMA or the NMPA have done inspections on the manufacturing plants of these various companies. So again, the regulatory agencies are really important. The NMPA, the FDA, the EMA, the MHRA, which is the regulatory agency in Great Britain, are all WHO approved. With that approval, the company can then take the vaccine forward to the World Health Organization for emergency use listing, EUL. And emergency use listing allows that vaccine to be used in COVAX and to be purchased by UN agencies. It's a very important mechanism because it says not only does the national regulatory authority think that this vaccine is good enough, safe enough, efficacious enough, but then now the World Health Organization agrees. Really an important approval.
We see a new administration in the United States coming in. They have apparently a very different approach regarding COVID-19 prevention, control, vaccination as well. And also their approach to international organizations such as WHO and platforms such as COVAX. So, Dr. Kim, as someone who is an expert in the field, how do you see this change could mean for real international cooperation, which you and your colleagues have been calling on for almost a year now regarding COVID-19?
Around the pandemic, countries of the world really do need to be united of a single voice. And I think that there's actually even now very important modeling information that would suggest that the high-income countries, the wealthiest countries, will suffer up to $5 trillion worth of economic damage if they do not help developing countries, low and middle income countries, gain access to vaccination. If the United States joins COVAX, then the largest economies of this world, and it's going to be very important because the UN Secretary General said it best, no one will be safe until everyone's safe.
Yeah.
So we really do need to work together to end this pandemic.
And that's all we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insights, CGTN, or check out our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching and